I want to talk today about one of the most common comments I get on social media in reference to identities of transgender, non-binary people is referring to it as a mental health disorder. And I want to talk about this because it's not a mental health disorder. It is a form of biodiversity, like many other things. The way the body and individuals develop, there's not a binary for anything. Everything is diverse the way it develops. I've talked in the past about chromosomes and anatomy, but there's all sorts of things like situs inversus, which is where a human is born with all the organs kind of flipped to the opposite side, and then when you what you expect. There's people that are born with two different colored eyes. There's tons of neurodiversity. All these are forms of biodiversity where it's not a problem, it's just a different way, a diverse way that individuals will develop. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk a little bit about the history within the medical community of how and why and when it changed as far as the medical views on gender diversity. And then I want to look at how we can examine our own beliefs that may be there about gender diversity. Because even if cognitively we know, okay, the DSM no longer refers to it as a disorder, then, and the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that's used for psychiatric disorders. So why it's no longer in there, we may intellectually know that, but we may still hold some inherent biases based on impressions we were given, things we were taught, etc. So we're going to talk about a little bit. The second thing is about how to examine that. And then the final thing is to really look at how this affects a medical practice. If we don't examine those things, how it may show up in practice. And so by doing that, having that awareness, we can serve our patients better. So let's start with that first part of history. Now, originally in the ICD code, which is our medical coding system in 1975, transsexualism was in there, but in the DSM, that psychiatric manual, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the third version in 1980 had transsexualism in it, but it was under gender identity disorder, which would be the term that was used for until 2013. Gender identity disorder and then transsexualism was a form of gender identity disorder, as well as a couple other things. So we see the term gender identity disorder brought in 1980. And then, like I said, with transsexualism being a form of that, and it's a term we don't use anymore. In fact, it was dropped in 1994 as a way of destigmatizing a gender diverse identity. So transsexualism was removed to try to destigmatize it, but gender identity remained in the DSM until 2013. And in 2013, and this is the important part, 2013, gender identity disorder was removed and in place was gender dysphoria, but it wasn't completely in place. They meant two different things. Gender identity disorder implied that how somebody identified, if it was not in alignment with what they were assigned at birth, with not alignment with the assumptions based on biology, then that was a disorder. That was a problem. And for many years, people have been speaking up and saying, no, this is not a problem. So what gender dysphoria did is it did not make someone's identity a problem. What it made is the distress a person felt because of the misalignment between what they were assigned at birth and how they identified. That any distress, which was believed to be more a cause of society and how society viewed those things and how society viewed not identifying as what you were assigned at birth, how society created that kind of stigma and created a distress. And what's important to understand about this, so it's about the distress someone may feel, because when people live as their true selves, they may be transgender and they may not have gender dysphoria when they live as their true selves. So something to be aware of, but that was the purpose. That was the thinking, the evolution of change. There was a recognition, and I'm going to say in the healthcare community, because outside the healthcare community, the transgender community recognized for many years for a lifetime that it wasn't a disorder. I mean, if we, and maybe I'll do another podcast on the history, but gender diverse identities have been around since the start of time. So that has been known for a long time that it was not a disorder. Having said that, in the medical community, it was in 2013 that officially the American Psychiatric Association changed it and said having a gender diverse identity is not a problem, but the distress someone may feel that needs to be treated to live as their true selves, to function well in this world, that gender dysphoria is where we can help. And I want to say, I mean, for all the healthcare providers, we know that to make a change as an institution, as the APA, to completely change that is not done on a whim. It's not like, okay, let's do this. Yeah. There are usually years of discussion and work done and research and so many things done to make changes like that. You know, sometimes the outside world's like, oh, it's political, it's this, it's that. It is done with a lot of people discussing, a lot of discussions, a lot of people in agreement, a lot of work done, and it's usually worked on over some time. Now, I'm not in the psychiatric world, so anyone that is there that's like thinks differently, please share it with me. I'm very open to hearing about it. But in general, that's how things work in medicine, right? So that's a little bit of the history. And so we think about that history and the fact that we stopped classifying as as a medical community, we stopped classifying in 2013. I don't know about you, but I'm older than that. So this brings me to our second point is how do we examine, because most of us were raised during a time where it was seen as a disorder, and where do we hold on to those beliefs? So I think about myself, and I remember, I don't know, I probably was a teenager at some point where I heard somebody talking about a coworker who was dating a transgender woman. Now, I didn't have that language at the time, but a transgender woman. And one thing I remember distinctly, it always stayed with me, is the person telling me about this transgender woman said, wow, and she must hate herself as a man so much. Something terrible must have happened to her as a man that made her not want to identify as a man anymore. And so, what that comment from somebody I looked up to saying that to me gave me the belief that gender diversity came from trauma. And that's important for me to recognize because I had to work through that. Because when our own loved one came out, and that was what I had to go on, as well as I was a psych major in college. So I learned gender identity disorder. So I learned that uh, any identity other than what you were assigned at birth was a disorder. So between those two things, being taught or taking on the belief that it was trauma and that the identity was disorder, that when our own loved one came out, it caused me to pause. It caused me to ask, did something happen to this person? Did we miss something? Was there a trauma along the way that wasn't identified? Like that was my thinking. And through my education, through my growth, realizing that that is not the case. That's not the reason. There's not necessarily a disorder. And especially loving and knowing this person, it's very clear that there is no disorder. This is just who they are. But that aside, I had to be willing to kind of look at that history, look at what I had been taught by people I respected, looked at what I'd been taught in school, and also look at what I had been taught through media. There is a great docu-series that was on Apple. I don't know if it's still there. I believe it's called Invisibilia. And if you haven't seen it, it's great. It's about how the LGBTQ plus community is portrayed in media. And in there, they talk about it, and I might be confusing documentaries. I think in there they talk about, as well as a documentary called Disclosure. In both of those series, they talk about how transgender people in movies are often portrayed as serial killers, murderers, or they are the victims. But that also perpetuates this kind of idea of some sort of disorder or something wrong, as well as many times if there is a transgender character in the media and the big reveal of that their identity that they are transgender is often viewed as deceitful, as that they're hiding something that just goes along with a little bit of this. So I think it's really important to take time to examine what are your own beliefs, what are the own messaging you got, whether from family or school or people you loved or the media, whatever it is, to really examine what that is, because I think it's from there that we begin to look at people and think of, oh, you know, somebody who is transgender or gender diverse in any way, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, non-binary, all the gender diversity, that people tend to look at that and go, oh, well, you know, they're histrionic or they must want attention, or these comments are very common. And so that's where when I hear that, I'm like, it's different if you're saying a person is this way versus we believe a person to be this way because of their identity. Those are two different things. And so I think this is what is important. So I encourage you to ask yourself, you know, what was your first understanding of transgender identities? What were you told? What did you learn? What did you observe, whether that was in the media or otherwise? Where do those thoughts creep in now? Do you notice them? And so I think this is really important because, like I said at the beginning, we may intellectually know that gender identity disorder no longer exists. It's the identity is not the disorder, it's the distress someone may feel from the identity. We may intellectually recognize that, but we may have some biases, some preconceived biases because of the way we were raised, because of what we were taught. If we don't examine them, then we don't begin to see where they may pop up. And so I encourage you to take the time to just reflect on those questions. What have I been told? What have I been taught? What was my first understanding? Like, when did I first ever hear about transgender identities or non-binary identities or any gender diverse identities? And what were my beliefs? What comes up for me when I see someone who is gender nonconforming, meaning somebody that their expression, what they wear does not conform to the gender they identify as. And this is really important work as healthcare providers, because this brings me into the very last point. How does this affect our practice? If we don't take a time to look at those inner beliefs, then it doesn't matter what we know intellectually, they creep in to our practice. I'll tell you a story of where this often shows up. And it's happened so many times that I hear people that have genuine complaints that go to their healthcare providers. And if they're transgender, there are a multitude of times that it is believed that it is psychosomatic, that it is in their head, often dismissed. I think of a story of one such person that went in with truly classic symptoms for GERD or reflux. So anytime they had a tendency to have a little bit of regurgitation into their mouth, it often was way worse after eating chocolate, after eating citrus, after eating spicy foods, and all, tests were done. So I give them credit for that. But since nothing showed in the test, it's like the history didn't matter. It must be psychosomatic. It must be, why am I thinking of the name of it? It must be, they told me, it'll come to me. Anyway, it must be in their brain that's creating this regurgitation. And yet one of the things that they said is that if it's created in the brain, then if it happens when they're chewing gum, it's not created in the brain because you distract yourself by chewing gum and it shouldn't happen. But for this person, they did it. They chewed gum after the meal and they still had the same regurgitation. We can get into the details. We can argue this and that, but the bottom line was it was a very quick to diagnose as a psychological disorder, an anxiety disorder, rather than really looking at the clinical symptoms. And this is not an uncommon story. I'm giving you a specific story, but it's not an uncommon story. And so the problem is, if we quickly dismiss this as a psychological disorder, if we stop looking at what's the symptomatology, what's the history here, what else is going on, what else can I do, all tests, I don't know of a test that's 100% sensitive and specific. So to hang your hat on tests alone and just be like, well, it must be in your mind, must be in your brain, is a problem for any patient. But this tends to happen more often with gender diverse patients. And I think it's because I believe, and there was more to the story with this practitioner that made me believe this practitioner had not been well educated on gender. There were other things I'm not going to go into that demonstrated that within the interactions with the patient. But this is why it's so important to really look at your beliefs and your biases, because we can miss diagnoses if we're quick to hang our hat on a psychological reason. We can lose follow-up and lose that important history and important care for the patient, because it doesn't feel good, I can tell you, as a patient, to be dismissed, to be invalidated on your symptoms and what is going on with you. Not many people want to return to a provider they do not feel like they're heard or listened to. So we lose being able to take the best care of a patient in that way too. So do the work, because we know that a psychological diagnosis for symptomatology is a last resort. It's a diagnosis of exclusion, that we cannot forget our clinical hat of looking at the symptoms and examining it well. This is why this isn't so important. This is why it's important to know the history. Why did it change? What's the terminology of why it changed? This is why, more than anything, if you take one thing out of this, is to look at your own beliefs. Look at because I think once you look at the messaging that you received from media, from family, from educators, from whomever, your own learning of gender and gender diversity, then you begin to identify where it may come up in your belief system now. So that's what I have to leave you with, is gender diversity, whether transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, any gender diverse identity is not a mental health disorder. It took us as a healthcare system a little while to get there, but we got there over a decade ago. And now it's our responsibility to look at our own beliefs, how they were formed. It makes sense. That's how we were taught. But it's time to let it go so we can and educate ourselves and recognize where those beliefs come up, so we can take the best care of patients the way that we desire to do. Have a great week and continue to engender love. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Engender Love. If you have more questions, visit my website at engenderlove.com.